63-year-old Bono and friends at U2 recently made history with their new single Atomic City, which the band released in conjunction with its 36th show residency at a strange place called Sphere in Las Vegas. More on that in a little bit. But with this song, for the 14th time, U2 historically has now topped more than any other band Billboard's Adult Alternative Airplay chart. 14 times being the leader on that chart with Atomic City. The chart originated in 1996, and as of yesterday, November 18th, as I'm speaking to you, they technically finally topped that chart, #1 single on Billboard's Adult Alternative Airplay chart. So an historic moment for a band in their 60s that somehow, despite being kind of driftless musically, which I'll talk about throughout this video, finding a way to make history with this new single. It's in an interesting top 10 of acts that have led this chart. U2 now being the top with 14. Coldplay with 13, so U2 overtook Coldplay. They had been tied at 13. Jack Johnson third with 11. Dave Matthews, both solo and with Dave Matthews Band, also has been the leader on this chart for 11 times. Completing the list are Death Cab for Cutie and John Mayer, who are tied at 8. The Black Keys, Counting Crows, Sheryl Crow, and R.E.M. all have 7 leaders on this chart over the years. Look, Atomic City, it's a nice single. It's catchy. It's a decently memorable guitar riff by The Edge. It's an above average U2 single. I don't find it to be profoundly inspiring, but I also don't find it to be terrible by any means. And for a band in their 60s, it's a pretty admirable effort. Bono's voice in particular strikes me. Much was made of Mick Jagger's voice sounding youthful at age 80 on Rolling Stone's last record, Hackney Diamonds, released last month. You can find my review of that on this channel. But Bono's voice to me at age 63 sounds every bit as youthful as Jagger's voice does at 80. This guy's voice is a miracle. This is the kind of hyperbolic statement you'll hear applied to aging artists all too frequently, but in this case I think it fits. I think Bono's voice, for the most part, sounds as sturdy as it has throughout his career. I mean, he sounds still capable of belting out, Where the Streets Have No Name and With or Without You and that stuff from the Joshua Tree or even earlier hits. So that's admirable too. I mean, he sounds pretty damn good as a singer in his 60s now. Other than that, though, the concern I have with U2 is I grew up with this stuff. I'm old enough to have actually, been alive when Joshua Tree came out, okay, in 1987. I mean, that stuff, you couldn't run away from it screaming, first of all. It was everywhere, constantly played on the radio, but that's okay because it was such beautiful, anthemic, just soaring stuff. I mean, those tracks from Joshua Tree, or Bullet the Blue Sky even, just found their way into your body and stayed there. I mean, that's how it was when this stuff came out. U2 in 1987, along with, perhaps to a bit of a lesser extent, George Michael, who released Faith that year, were ubiquitous everywhere. It was very hard to find your way away from that stuff, but he didn't necessarily want to. At least I didn't. I still get chills sometimes listening to those songs of my youth from U2's 80s output throughout that decade. You listen to Gloria from, I think it was their second record, October. I love that stuff. That very early U2 stuff is gorgeous. That's when they were an energized band full of vigor and creative ideas and energy and pushing boundaries. And that's the band that U2, to my ear, hasn't been in too long. So, don't take it from me. I mean, take it from Quincy Jones, an outright legend, right? Quincy Jones was interviewed for Vulture by David Marchese, a journalist you've heard a lot about from me in my last 2 videos on the Jan Wenner Bob Dylan controversy. David Marchese, again, the journalist who interviews Quincy Jones in 2018 for Vulture. Now, Quincy Jones today, as I'm speaking to you, is 90 years old, but 80 Grammy nominations, 127 of them, produced Thriller for Michael Jackson, produced one of my favorite tracks, Give Me the Night by George Benson. This guy is one of the overarching, all-time, inimitable legends of pop music, okay? And kind of out of nowhere, Marchese asks him, is U2 still making good music? And the answer is just a bracketed narration, shakes head. So Quincy Jones hears this question at the time of this interview, about 85 years old, and just sits there going, okay, so that's a pretty resounding condemnation of U2's abilities as a or just the extent to which U2 is an interesting band at this moment. Now, Marchese, being the good journalist that he is, says, why not? Presses Quincy a little bit. And he says, I don't know. I love Bono with all my heart, but there's too much pressure on the band. He's doing good work all over the world. Working with him and Bob Geldof on Debt Relief was one of the greatest things I ever did. It's up there with We Are the World. He worked with Bono, among many other artists, of course, on that track in the 80s with Bob Geldof. But I think Stephen Thomas Erlewine, one of our best music journalists, puts it more specifically as to what exactly the problem is with U2. Why is it that their music really hasn't yielded important songs in quite some time? Listen to the language of Erlewine's review of their 2023 album Songs of Surrender, which, interesting enough, I mean, talk about something that evokes a rudderless band. Well, that's a record of remakes of back catalog U2 tracks, okay? So you hear that and you're thinking, man, this is a band that's really fighting hard to find its way forward and not finding a path. So they come out with 40 remakes of back catalog songs. And Erlewine's listening to this, and he ends up coming up with this description of it. He says, it's music made from the vantage point of reflection rather than risk. It's stylish background music that sounds like it was designed to be heard in chain coffee houses during the late 2000s. He goes on with regard to their prior album, 2017 Songs of Experience. And about that record, Erlewine says, the production seems afraid of alienating any constituent. Exactly. Lastly, he says of that record that Songs of Innocence in 2014. He says they've replaced surging melodrama with a brilliant, insistent clamor that's intended to dazzle. It's busy enough to be bracing, yet it's also wearying, exuding a faint air of desperation that dampens the emotional pull. I couldn't agree more. I really think that U2 hasn't been a band that takes risks, hasn't been a band that pushes boundaries since they came out with Pop in 1997. In that moment, they were a band, critical or commercial success be damned, they were just following their own creative path, charting their own course, not trying to recapture old glories, just pushing forward. And the world could make of it what it would, but they were having fun as a band in that moment. That's possibly the last time I've really heard them enjoying themselves, having fun, making music without being self-conscious about the large shadow that their prior output casts over the band these days. And that was impressive. They were fresh. I mean, you think about 1993's Zeropa, the album before that. Another great example of a band that's still taking risks, still pushing boundaries, still finding a fresh voice, some fresh ideas to work with. On Atomic City, they're working with a couple of old hands in U2 lore. So, I mean, Steve Lillywhite has a hand in producing this record. Steve Lillywhite produced their first 3 records. He produced Boy in 1980. He produced October the following year, and War in 1983. And he's he had a hand in mixing the Joshua Tree. He was involved in projects like dismantling the atomic bomb in 2014, No Line on the Horizon in 2009. So, this is, aside from his U2 work, he's done huge stuff with, Taylor Swift, Modest Mouse, Weezer, R.E.M, Snow Patrol, Michelle Branch. He did a beautiful Neil Diamond album that I love called Melody Road. That's one of my favorite latter-day Neil Diamond records. So, Steve Lillywhite's there. They've been working with this guy for at least 43 years now, here in 2023. And then Jackknife Lee also has a hand in working on this song. Jackknife Lee goes back to How to Dismantle the Atomic Bomb in 2004. He played a big role in the 2017 album Songs of Experience. So these are guys that go pretty far back with U2. And to me, I get it. They're familiar with these guys. They have a rapport with them creatively and personally. So you want to work with people who you know, right? But man, with these legacy bands, I wish they would find it within themselves to take a chance with some younger, newer producers who might bring some fresh vigor to the recording process, might bring some fresh ideas to the studio. For my money, one of the best examples of that is when Paul McCartney came out with an album called New in 2013, on which he worked with 4 different producers, guys who had produced like Lily Allen, Kings of Leon, Adele, Amy Winehouse, Florence and the Machine. And that album was great. I mean, that's one of the finest latter-day Paul McCartney albums, bar none. You got to hear it if you have any interest in Paul McCartney or the Beatles. Check out New from 2013. That's Paul McCartney wanting new ideas, welcoming challenge, welcoming younger voices in the production process, and the fruits of that daring were enormous. It's a terrific record. I don't understand why these older legacy bands like U2 don't take that kind of a chance more often. I really feel like even if critically it's not a success, at least they will have tried, right? At least they will have tried to chart a new course, put their best foot forward with someone or something new. But see, the weird thing about U2 these days is, rather than actually make music that is or sounds daring, Bono seems content to just sort of make gestures at such music in words only. In fact, he described Atomic City, Rolling Stone reported, as, quote, a rock and roll 45 in the tradition of late 70s post-punk, Blondie, and The Clash. Well, here's the interesting thing. Stephen Thomas Erlewine called them out on that, basically on Songs of Innocence, which begins with a track called The Miracle of Joey Ramone. And Erlewine says of that track, it doesn't sound a thing like the Ramones. And he continues, nor does the song called This Is Where You Can Reach Me Now sound like its reported inspiration, The Clash. Again, so Bono's been going on about trying to sound like The Clash or pay homage to them or whatever for at least a decade now. But it isn't in the music, buddy. That kind of freshness and daring just isn't there. U2 these days, and for a while now, has been making music far too safe to resemble these titans of punk and post-punk that he sings the praises of, but can't seem to capture in the studio. And I'm drawn to this idea that Rick Beato advances about the Beatles, and he's got this idea of bands that stopped making music at the right time. For Rick, the Beatles were just such a band. Of course, Let It Be in 1970 being their final record. They never got together again with John Lennon, who was, of course, assassinated in 1980. After that, they got together with George Harrison in the mid-90s and cut a few tracks, Free as a Bird and Real Love. But other than that, they stopped making music in 1970 and they went in their own four directions. And some of the results on their respective solo output were tremendous. Of course, we get Imagine from John Lennon. We get R.E.M. from Paul McCartney. George Harrison comes out with some terrific stuff in the early 70s as well. And Ringo Starr with his All-Star Band, cool stuff from him also. But with these guys, one example of a band that does that pushed boundaries boldly and daringly, come what may, and kept doing so and keeps doing so, would be Radiohead. I mean, the about face of Kid A in the aftermath of the enormous success of OK Computer was a shock to me and to plenty of people. Tom York, he figured OK Computer was terrific, great, but we're going to do our own thing on OK Computer and on Hail to the Thief and everything they released since then. But then Tom York wasn't content to just keep working with Radiohead. He puts together this supergroup called Atoms for Peace with the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Flea, Nigel Goodrich from Radiohead works with the very in-demand drummer with Beck and R.E.M, Joey Waronker, who seems to be everywhere. And he's done his own solo, I think 3 solo albums Tom York has done. And it's interesting, the analogy that I feel compelled to draw with Radiohead, because if you listen to Atomic City alongside one of my favorite Radiohead tracks, Electioneering, you too might hear an almost disarming extent of similarity between the song's respective guitar riffs. Check that out. Listen to them side by side and see what you think. So maybe U2 is a band that should have perhaps stopped recording as a unit long ago. Maybe they are not just past their prime in terms of age, but in terms of sort of creative vigor and ideas. Maybe they would have been best served by doing their own thing. I'm sure the Edge solo on his own or with bands that he puts together on the side is or would be capable of some interesting stuff. So I don't know. I'm just not sure where U2 stands as a band in 2023. Atomic City has made history. You can't argue with that. Great. Good for them. But, you know, as I mentioned, it was released in conjunction with this place called the Sphere in Las Vegas. Now, a word about this place, because there was this brilliant story put up by a guy who seems to have gone for The Atlantic, a magazine, to the opening show that U2 did at the Sphere on September 29th. That's kicked off their residency at this place. And listen to, I mean, the writing is great. The title is hilarious. They titled the article Sphere and Loathing in Las Vegas. Very clever. And he says this about Sphere. It is the architectural embodiment of ridiculously, a monument to spectacle, and to the exceedingly human condition of erecting bewildering edifices simply because we can. It cost $2.3 billion, $2.3 billion with a B dollars. It's blanketed in 580,000 square feet of LED lights. It can transform its 366-foot-tall exterior into a gargantuan emoji that astronauts supposedly can see from space. This is no half dome and certainly not a rotunda. This is Sphere. He goes on later in the story to say the Sphere may not survive in Vegas. Last week, as of the time this article came out, the company running the building reported a $98.4 million loss in just the past quarter, and its CFO resigned. Whoopsies. He also says that as he was watching videos of the Sphere's luminescence, it dominated the intensely famous Irishman on stage, and he felt like he was watching its splendor turn the rockers into what Charlie Wartzel, the author of this story, calls wee leather-jacketed ants. Reportedly, he goes on, the building has calming sensory rooms for patrons who experience vertigo. Interesting, given that Vertigo was one of the singles from the 2004 U2 record, How to Dismantle the Atom Bomb, or find the pulsing light show to be too much. What the Sphere is selling isn't all that deep. It's a huge, loud concert room where you can witness rock gods play the hits and watch a building facade pulse, jiggle, melt, and transform into thousands of shimmering colors. A bit like a roller coaster, the Sphere offers the thrill of feeling a strong and most essentially new sensation that you can't get anywhere else. The edge in the Sphere might at any second, he says of his experience watching U2 perform there, snap into action and punch us in the teeth with a guitar riff. But he also makes allusions to $30 tequila sodas and describes the venue as gaudy and overly commercialized. For a band who Stephen Thomas Erlewine pegs as recording music that sounds more fitting of a chain coffee house in the late 2000s than it does of a band in full possession of its creative faculties as it was way back in the day, or even on Octoon Baby, right, in 1991, which is the album from which they're performing most of their stuff at Sphere during this residency. That seems pretty fitting. So I don't know. I mean, check out Atomic City yourself. See what you think. As I said, it's a nice, above-average U2 single. It's got a nice, catchy guitar riff, albeit evocative, perhaps too much of Electioneering by Radiohead. Let me know in the comments what you think of Atomic City. If you've gone to any of these shows at Sphere, ridiculous as the venue may be, I'd love to hear from you about your experience there as well.